Hello everyone, this is Mr. Underkoffler, and today we're going to be looking at a page of guided notes. Actually, it's two pages stapled together that I never put a title on it. I probably should have. This is basically going to be an introduction to problems that have two things happening to the variable, and therefore two inverse operations will be need to be used in order to solve them. And you're going to see that on these problems, where if you find where the variable is, you will notice it's not just one thing happening to the variable, there's going to be a second thing happening to the variable. And since we're now going to have two things happening to the variable, then we're going to need two inverse operations. Now that doesn't sound like that big of a deal, but the one thing that is going to be a big deal is knowing what order you will follow. So let's quickly review something, and you might want to jot this down. The order that we have been using to evaluate expressions or to simplify expressions, the order we've been using has been the order of operations, which we sometimes just call it PEMDAS. Some people call it, please excuse my dear Aunt Sally. That's the normal, quote unquote, order that we follow when we evaluate expressions or when we simplify expressions. That's the normal order. Now, that's the order that you're going to use when you answer what's happening to the variable. So the first thing and the second thing that is happening to the variable, you will be thinking of PEMDAS. Okay, parentheses first, exponent second, then multiplication and division, then finally addition and subtraction. Now, I'm going to be nice to you today. There will be no parentheses or exponents in any of today's equations. So really, we're just looking at multiplication, division, addition, and subtraction. So when you're answering what's happening to the variable, the multiplication and division piece will be first. The addition and subtraction piece will be last or second. But what about inverse operations? The word inverse means the opposite, right? The inverse of addition is subtraction, right? The inverse of multiplication is division. So the word inverse is like a synonym for the word opposite. Well, then what order should we follow for inverse operations? Well, it only makes sense that it would be the inverse order of normal. So instead of PEMDAS, it would be the acronym, and I know this is kind of funny, but the acronym SADMAP. That does not mean I want you to be sad as you do today's guided notes, but I want you to understand, instead of addition and subtraction being last, now it's going to be first. And instead of multiplication and division being first, well, now it's going to be second. So that's what I'm really trying to tell you here. When you answer what's the inverse operation, you are going to be thinking for first and second, you're going to be thinking completely backwards order from normal. Instead of PEMDAS, it will be SADMAP. Instead of multiplication first and division first, and then addition and subtraction second, it's going to be completely flip-flop from that, where subtraction and addition will be first, division and multiplication will be second. And then step 3, we will put the first inverse operation underneath on both sides, and then a little bit lower down. Then later we will do the second inverse operation, lower underneath on both sides. So you're not going to do both inverse operations at the exact same place, okay? There's going to be, some spacing involved. And then step 4, if there's subtraction anywhere, we will make it out in the opposite. Now, here's what's special about today's problems. We are not going to actually solve the problem. So we will not actually get answers, so to speak. We will not work down and actually do the addition, subtraction, multiplication, or division. We won't. We will do that the next day when we do guided notes. The reason I'm doing this where we're not solving today is because I want you to focus today on just the new concept. And that new concept today is that there's going to be two things happening to the variable, and therefore two inverse operations that you will do. And when you answer what's happening to the variable, you're doing PEMDAS for the order that you answer that question. But when you figure out what the inverse operations are, the order that the inverse operations will be done in will be the inverse order from normal. So instead of doing multiplication and division, then addition and subtraction, it will be completely flip-flopped from that, because the word inverse means the opposite. All right, let's do some problems together. Let's start with number 1. What's happening to the variable? Now, you might want to give yourself a reminder here, okay? We are going to be following the order of PEMDAS, okay? That is the order that we follow when we answer what's happening to the variable. But when we do inverse operations, that's where we're later going to be doing inverse order from normal. That's where instead of PEMDAS, it will be the order of SADMEP. Okay? And I know that acronym sounds funny. I know, but bear with me here. Okay, so what's happening to the variable? Well, I already highlighted for you where the variable was and the numbers that are near it. As you can see, the 9 is right next to the h. That means it is being multiplied by 9. But then there's also an adding by 23. So that's the second thing happening to the variable. Now, how does this relate to PEMDAS? Multiplying by 9. Notice how multiplication is before addition. The addition is second. The multiplication is first. That's the order of PEMDAS. But that has to be completely flip-flopped for the inverse operations, which means the subtraction and addition has to be done before the division and multiplication, because inverse is a synonym for the word opposite, and therefore the order of what's happening to the variable will be inversed, will be flip-flopped for figuring out the inverse operations. Here's what I'm basically trying to tell you, and you can draw this on your paper as well. What was first will be inversed last. What was last will be inversed first. That's how this works, because inverse means opposite. So, what's the inverse of adding by 23? Subtracting by 23. That will be the first inverse operation. Even though adding by 23 was the second thing happening to the variable, inverse means opposite. So what was last will now be inversed first. And then the second inverse operation will be the inverse of the multiplying by 9, which was the first thing happening to the variable. And the inverse of multiplication, of course, is division. So the second inverse operation that we will do is to divide by 9. We're not solving the problems today for real because I just want you to focus on the new concepts today. How there's two things happening to the variable, therefore two inverse operations. And how the order for what's happening to the variable is the normal order, PEMDAS. But inverse order is backwards. And therefore, the first inverse operations will be adding or subtracting. The last inverse operations will be multiplying or dividing. Okay, we just got done saying that the first inverse operation that we will do was to subtract by 23. So let's go ahead and write that underneath the problem on both sides. That is the first inverse. Now, if we were solving for real, we would have, answers underneath. But we're not going to solve for real today. But having said that, I almost totally forgot. There is a fourth part of the directions. If there's subtraction anywhere, we will make it adding the opposite. Is there subtraction on the original equation, 9h plus 23? No. Is there subtraction of our first inverse operation? Oh yeah, we're subtracting by 23 on both sides. So here we go. Add the opposite on the subtracting by 23. Add the opposite on the subtracting by 23. Okay, if we were solving for real, we would put answers underneath this result bar, right? But we're not solving for real today. So you can skip that space or you can just scribble in it if that's fun for you. Yay, scribbly scrabblies in math today, woohoo, whatever makes you happy. But lower is where we're going to now do the other inverse operation, the one that we had specifically said would be our second inverse operation, and that is to divide by 9. So let's now do that on both sides. Remember, the equal sign lines up if we were solving for real. So please make sure that not only did you subtract by 23 on both sides of that, you're dividing by 9 on both sides of that. So think of this invisible wall here from this equal sign. Make sure you're doing it on both sides. And again, we're not solving for real today. If we were solving for real today, then there would be answers underneath this result bar. So you can just leave that blank, or you can scribble in it if that makes you happy. Maybe some of you will find this therapeutic, like you're taking out your anger today on the paper. I don't know, whatever. So that's what we're doing today. We're focusing on how there's two things happening to the variable, therefore there's two inverse operations. But the order will be flip-flopped for the inverse operations because, logically speaking, the word inverse means the opposite. And that's why the order also is done in the opposite way for the inverse operations. Okay, let's do another example together. Problem number 2. What's happening to the variable? Now remember, the order of PEMDAS is used for what's happening to the variable. And you will see the variable x has a -7 right next to it. That means it is being multiplied by -7 first. And then we can see it is being subtracted by 5 next. So that is the second thing happening to the variable. Now, what will be the first inverse operation? Will it be the inverse of multiplying by -7, which is dividing by -7? Or will it be the inverse of subtracting by 5, which would be adding by 5? What should be the first inverse operation? Have you figured it out? Well, as I told you before, what was last will now be inversed first. What was first will be inversed last. And therefore, the first inverse operation should be the inverse of subtracting by 5, which is adding by 5. The second inverse operation should be the inverse of multiplying by -7, which is dividing by -7. Okay, time for us to actually write it underneath the equation on both sides. We just got done saying that the first inverse operation was add by 5. So let's do that on the left of the equal sign and on the right of the equal sign. And please line it up in a way that makes sense. Your +5 should be underneath the -5 because that's the part that you are inversing. Do not put the +5 underneath the -7 because that would make no sense. That's not the part you're inversing at that moment in time. So make sure you have the +5 underneath the -5. Make sure the other +5 is on the right side of the equation underneath the 68. Now, we're not going to solve for real, so leave a blank space underneath the result bar. If you want to put scribbles in there, fine. Now, lower is where we're going to now do the second inverse operation. And that second inverse operation we said was to divide by -7. So now let's put that underneath. Make sure it's on both sides. Please remember, the equal sign separates the left side from the right side. I didn't even line this up really well. I should have put that dividing by -7 on the right a little bit further over. So my apologies. Please make sure you have the negative signs there. I apologize. I kind of made them a little tiny here. But make sure you have the negative signs. And then again, we're not solving for real today. We're not. So if you want to put scribbly scrobblies underneath the results bar, you may. There is a part to the directions that I totally forgot to do. Let me get rid of all this unnecessary highlighting. Remember, there's a fourth part to the directions where we make any place where we see subtraction become adding the opposite. Where do we have subtraction? The +5s are not subtraction. But on the original problem, we had -7x minus 5. So that's where you would make subtraction, adding the opposite. Okay, I want to do one more problem with you. One more. And that might as well be number 3. So, pencils in your hand, let's do number 3. Here we go. What's happening to the variable? Well, since we can see that the variable is the u, and it is over -8, then that means it is being divided by negative 8. And that's the first thing happening to the variable. Then the second thing happening to the variable, a little bit to the right of it, is being added by negative 1. And so that's the second thing happening to the variable. That is the order of PEMDAS, ladies and gentlemen. What's happening to the variable? We multiply or divide first, add or subtract last. Now, what should be the first inverse operation? Should it be the inverse of dividing by negative 8, which would be multiplying by negative 8? Or should it be the inverse of adding by negative 1, which would be subtracting by negative 1? Can you figure out what the first inverse operation would be? All right, I hope you figured that out. What was last will now be inversed first. What was first will now be inversed last. It might help some of you to draw what I just drew there, especially if you're a visual learner. Others of you, maybe that doesn't help. Maybe you don't need that. I don't know. So here we go. The first inverse operation should be the inverse of the last thing that was happening to the variable, which was adding by negative 1. The inverse of addition is subtraction, but do not change that negative 1. It should still be negative. Please, 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 please make sure that you have the negative sign. Okay, the second inverse operation that we will do lower underneath on both sides will be the inverse of the first thing that was originally happening to the variable. The first thing happening to the variable was being divided by negative 8. So the inverse of that would be to multiply by negative 8. And again, I cannot emphasize enough, you need to make sure you pay attention to the details, have the negatives. Lots of negatives on this problem, I know. Okay, we said the first inverse operation was to subtract by negative 1. So let's write that underneath on both sides. Now I need to make sure that you are not missing the details here. Notice I said subtract, and then I said by negative. Do you have a slash for subtracting, and then do you have one for the negative? Traditionally, textbooks then would probably put that negative in parentheses. If that makes you happy to put the negative in parentheses, the negative 1 in parentheses, fine. I don't personally care if you draw the parentheses or not. But there you go. Make sure you have both, the slash for the subtraction and also the other one for the negative. Okay, let me get rid of all this unnecessary highlighting. All right. Where do we have subtraction? Because we're supposed to make it add in the opposite. Well, clearly, we just said we're going to subtract by negative 1. So subtraction is the same as adding the opposite. Subtraction is the same as adding the opposite. Please make sure you do that. Underneath the result bar, you can scribble if you want or just leave it blank. And then lower down, we are going to do the second inverse operation, which is to multiply by negative 8. So let's put that underneath on both sides. Remember, when I say both sides, the equal sign separates the left side from the right side. Make sure you are doing it on both sides of the equation. And also, did you make sure that this minus negative 1 that turned into plus positive 1, is that underneath your plus negative 1? Because that's where it would make sense. That's the part you're inversing, okay? And then, of course, the other one is underneath the 35. All right, I have done 3 examples with you. I hope by now you are getting the hang of this. So, would like for you to try 4, 5, and 6 from the first page on your own. Then hit play when you're ready to see how you did on those 3 problems. So hit pause, do 4, 5, and 6 from the first page on your own. Then hit play when you're ready to see how you did. Okay, I hope you already did 4, 5, and 6. Let's see how you did. What was the first thing happening to the variable? It was being divided by 22. You can see that, z over 22, variable is being divided by 22. What was the second thing happening to the variable? It was being subtracted by negative 64. Make sure you have the negative. The first inverse should be adding by negative 64. As I've told you before, what was last will be inversed first. What was first will be inversed last. So the second inverse operation should be multiplying by 22. All right, did you do the first inverse operation first? Did you add by negative 64 on both sides? Did you make subtraction on the original equation then become adding the opposite, adding a positive 64? And then lower, you should have done the second inverse operation, which was to multiply by 22. Please make sure you have things lined up properly. The plus negative 64 should be underneath the minus negative 64, which turned into plus positive 64. Make sure they're lined up properly. Make sure the inverse operations on the right are to the right of the invisible border of the equal sign. Again, Mr. Underkoffler could have even done a little bit better there with that plus negative 64 on the right. So make sure you have these things lined up as properly as you could. Problem number 5. What's happening to the variable? Now this one was unique. Did you see the variable was a little bit further to the right than it has been on the other problems? Pay attention to details. The very first thing next to that variable was the negative 2. And the negative 2 being next to the variable means multiplication. Did you say the first thing was that it was being multiplied by negative 2 and then it's being added by 34 secondly? If you messed up on that part, then you're going to need to fix number 5. Hit pause on the video if you need to and fix whatever you need to fix. Okay, for those of you who needed to hit pause and fix everything else, hopefully you did that. The first inverse should be subtract by 34. The second inverse should be divide by negative 2. As I've said before, what was first will be inversed, or sorry, what was last will be inversed first. What was first originally having the variable will be inversed last. Okay, did you do the first inverse operation first, subtracting by 34? Did you line it up properly? Notice the one on the far left is underneath the 34. It better be. That's the part you're inversing. If you have it underneath the negative 2y, then erase it and fix it. Yes, it does matter. It does. Now, later, you should have divided by negative 2. Last thing, and I hope you didn't forget to do this. This is the fourth part of the directions. Where did we have subtraction? We had it on the subtracting by 34s. Should be made out in the opposite there, and also over on the right. Okay, problem number 6. What was happening to the variable? This time the variable was on the right-hand side of the equal sign. The first thing happening to it was the multiplying by 16, and then the second thing happening to it was the subtracting by 42. First inverse, add by 42. Second inverse, divide by 16. Did you add by 42 first on both sides? Do you have it lined up properly? The equal sign separates the left side from the right side, so you better have an adding by 42 on the left underneath the negative 90, and you better have the other adding by 42 underneath the subtracting by 42. Do not put it underneath the 16w because that's not the part you're inversing at that moment. Later, you will divide by 16 on both sides. Did you make the subtraction of 42 become adding the opposite? All right, that's the first page. There is also a second page, and I would love for you to do that as well, or at least let's compromise, maybe half of the problems on the second page. I'll let you pick which ones, okay? So there's 6 problems. Do at least half of them, and then hit play when you're ready to see how you did. So hit pause, do at least 3 out of these 6 problems, then hit play when you're ready to see how you did. Okay, I hope you already did 1 through 6, or at least half of them. Let's see how you did. The first thing happening on number 1 was that it was being multiplied by 8. The second thing happening was it was being added by 21. That's the order of PEMDAS. First inverse, subtract by 21. Second inverse, divide by 8. Maybe it helps some of you to draw these type of things. What was last gets inversed first. What was first gets inversed last. Maybe that type of thing helps you. I don't know. All right, first inverse, subtract by 21. Boom. Did you do it on both sides? Last inverse, later, divide by 8. Where do we have subtraction? Well, we have them on the subtracting by 21s. That's where you make it adding the opposite. Number 2, for those of you who did this problem. First thing happening to the variable was being multiplied by negative 12. Second thing, subtracted by 7. First inverse, add by 7. Second inverse, divide by negative 12. Did you add by 7 first on both sides? Did you later divide by negative 12 on both sides? And please check that you have the negative signs on those dividing by negative 12s. Where do we have subtraction? We have it on the original problem. That's where you make it adding the opposite. Problem number 3, for those of you who did this problem. The variable was being divided by 5. That's what that fraction means, division. Then it was being added by 13. First inverse, subtract by 13. Second inverse, and multiply by 5. Did you do the first inverse first, subtracting by 13? Did you do the second inverse second? Multiply by 5. Where do we have subtraction? We have it on the subtracting by 13s. That's where you make it become adding the opposite. Problem number 4, for those of you who did it. First thing happening was dividing by negative 9. Second thing happening was subtracting by 20. First inverse, add by 20. Second inverse, multiply by negative 5. So you added by 20 on both sides. Later, multiply by negative 9. Do you have the negative signs? Then you look for subtraction. It was on the original equation. That's where you make it adding the opposite. Problem number 5, for those of you who did it. First thing happening to the variable, dividing by 2. Second thing happening to the variable was subtracted by negative 3. First inverse, add by negative 3. Second inverse, multiply by 2. Did you do the first inverse first? Add by negative 3. Please line it up properly. One of them should be underneath the minus negative 3. The other one should be underneath the negative 11. Then later you will multiply by 2. Again, try to make sure you have it lined up properly. The equal sign is the invisible wall. You better do it on both sides of that equal sign. And then the last thing you do is you look for subtraction. It was on the original equation. That's where you make it adding the opposite, adding a positive. And that does not change the meaning of subtracting by negative 3. It's the same as adding by positive 3. All right, for those of you who did number 6, the first thing happening to the variable, this was a little bit different. There was a problem like this on the first page. The variable's here. The first thing happening to it is being multiplied. That's what that means when it's right next to it. Multiplied by negative 11. The second thing happening to the variable, and you can read backwards with addition, that's okay. Commutative property tells you the order of addition doesn't matter. So the second thing happening to that W is it's being added by 6. Which means the first inverse is subtract by 6, because as I've said over and over again on this video, what was first will be inversed second, and what was second will be inversed first. So the order continually flip-flops when you go from what's happening to the variable to the order that you do your inverse operations in. And therefore, the second inverse is to divide by negative 11. Okay, did you subtract by 6 first on both sides? Please check the alignment. Yes, I'm very picky about this. You should be too. That minus 6 better be underneath the other 6, and the other minus 6 better be underneath the negative 71. Later, you will divide by negative 11 on both sides. As I've told you before, the equal sign is the divider between the left side and the right side. Make sure you're doing your inverse operations on both sides. Where do we have subtraction? We have it on the very first inverse operation that we were doing on both sides. So that's where you make it adding the opposite, and the other place as well, adding the opposite. And that is the end of this video in this packet of untitled guided notes, where I'm introducing you to the idea of having 2 things happening to the variable and 2 inverse operations. You will use PEMDAS for when you answer what's happening to the variable, because that's the normal order. And then you will go reverse order for your inverse operations, because the word inverse means the opposite. And the opposite of PEMDAS is, humorously said, SADMEP. That's the order you follow for your inverse operations. Thanks for watching this video. We will see you next time.